Well, politics can be brutal and unforgiving, especially if you hold yourself out as believing in one thing to gain political advantage, but then acting in the manner that you attacked. You can expect to be brutally exposed, and David Pope, the cartoonist for the Canberra Times, did that just this week. He skewered Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg for abandoning every tenet of conservative economic philosophy. For over 10 years, the Liberal Party mercilessly attacked Wayne Swan for increasing spending and debt as he fought to save jobs during the global financial crisis. They claimed debt and deficit were inherently evil and that only the Liberal Party could save Australia from the Labor wreckers. Government intervention in the economy was socialism. And Tony Abbott tasked Malcolm Turnbull with destroying the NBN, something that millions of Australian homes are discovering today Turnbull succeeded in achieving. The government even went to the last election boasting it was back in black. They even produced mugs to highlight it. And the utter hypocrisy of the government's current actions, given 10 years of statements, are hidden by the serious health crisis facing the nation. And the government wants you to focus on its health message and efforts to save lives as they should. But there will come a time as the crisis eases where the focus shifts back to the policy positions enacted by this government. So let me remind you of just some of them so far. $130 billion of wage subsidies, $66 billion of stimulus, including direct payments to households. They've effectively nationalised private hospitals. We've got free childcare, residential rent moratorium, no evictions allowed, commercial landlords required to discount rents, all foreign investment to be examined by FIRB. And I know one thing for certain, from 2013 till the end of this government, it will never deliver a balanced budget. And you know what? The sky will not fall. Now, I don't expect Abbott or Turnbull or even Morrison to admit their claims of Labor fiscal mismanagement were pathetic political posturing, but they should privately give Wayne a call and apologise. And while he waits for that to happen, he, like all of us, can enjoy this scene from one of my favourite movies.
Bear. The bear.
Do you see the light?
The bear.
Do you see the light?
What light?
Have you seen the light?
Yes! Yes! Jesus H. Goddamn Christ! I have seen the light!
Well, Corey, what do you got to say about that?
Well, you know the world is broken when the Conservatives are enacting socialist policies and the Socialists are starting to complain about them because, you know, they're too much of what they like. This is crazy. I agree with you, Stephen. I don't like hypocrisy in politics. And, you know, the position you take in politics is often driven by the position you have. But I just do think that this is a stimulus package that is absolutely unprecedented. But the one saving grace is this. This money that they're throwing out is actually going to people who have lost their jobs. It's not going to people overseas or to dead people as it was under your stimulus. They're not saying we're going to build tens of thousands of school halls at whatever cost that is, or they're not having a pink bats program. They're trying to put money into people's pockets. I think the reason it's going into their pockets is because governments have taken other decisions which have cost them jobs and limited their ability to earn a buck. So at least it's targeted. I just think it's massively excessive, and I'm hoping that Michael will agree with me on that.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, for sure, Corey. I mean, I think it is excessive. Well, it's certainly getting to the point where it's going to be excessive. As one of the younger members of the panel, I suppose it'll be up to my generation and those after me to at least try to touch paying down this debt. We've never had so much debt, and we're going to really get nothing for it productive. There'll be no Snowy 2.0, there'll be no high-speed rail link up and down the eastern seaboard, there'll be no new dams, no new power stations, no nuclear push, nothing. So I understand why the government's spending the money, but equally it's a hell of a lot of money, and as we all seem to accept, there probably will be another pandemic of sorts in the next 50 years. There no doubt will be another day of economic reckoning in the next 10 or 20 years. I'm not sure the government's ability to borrow again, and if it does, heaven help us, because the debt is enormous. And this is, I suppose, part of the intergenerational saga here. The health impact of this virus is disproportionately on those over the age of 70. The economic impact will be disproportionately on those under the age of 40. And that's something that certainly has to be discussed.
Well, I've just been enjoying watching Corey trying to explain that that global financial crisis thing. That I remember the Liberals and all him and his mates saying at the time, it's a 6-week Northern Hemisphere issue. It wasn't anything that the country should have responded to in that way. But I'm glad to see that you're on board to try and save hundreds of thousands of Australian jobs as they've been tossed onto the unemployment list. But Daisy, your thoughts?
Well, I come at this issue from a relatively unique perspective in the fact that I was about 19 at the start of the global financial crisis and not at all interested in politics, so I'm somewhat unencumbered, shall we say, by the sort of, party sort of grievances and the back and forth that went on there. So from my position as a relative observer of this situation, I think it's possibly a little bit of an exaggeration to say that the Liberal Party has abandoned any kind of conservative economic philosophy. I was listening to Michael Sakar on just let me finish. I was listening to him on Sky News on the 31st of March, and when questioned, he said that, to quote him, the Liberal Party is going to suspend ideology for the good of the Australian people. Yes, so it's sort of useful for them not to be ideologues at the moment, and in a funny sort of way, they should be commended for that. So I would say that this, rather than completely abandoning any kind of policy, this is what you would call a temporary deviation based on necessity rather than will, particularly since Michael Sakar also said that the government, when he was questioned, was very committed to delivering the next round of tax cuts in a couple of years. So I would hardly call that an abandonment of conservative economic policy. And as Corey said, all of this money, yes, it's a lot. I don't know if we need 6 months of it, given what we've already discussed on this panel, but it is targeted. Hopefully it will have the kind of hibernation effect that they want. But I would just be a little bit wary, really, for anyone to engage in any kind of, lulu, so they say, about political posturing, lest they risk engaging in the same pathetic political posturing that they are decrying. Dare I say it, and no offence, Stephen.
For none taken. For 10 years, debt and deficit were evil. And now I'm loving watching all the right-wing commentators, the so-called right-wing economic experts, having to suck it up because Labor had to take drastic action to save 200,000 jobs. And the Liberal Party and Corey and all his mates in Parliament at the time, they just would have none of that. No excuses for having to actually save jobs. Now there's a good excuse. Fantastic. I love it.
And Stephen, I'm still having none of it. You've used that term, 200,000 jobs. It was going to be 200,000 deaths in Australia. It was going to be 200,000 deaths in Europe, 200,000 deaths in the USA. They just make these figures up. They're just fed into a model, and you panic, and you have to pay the price of that for a very, very long time. Now, yes, the government, I think, has gone about this in a different manner, but at least they're spending the money by putting it in people's pockets. But the legacy of this is going to be used by the Labor Party, and you tell me, we'll revisit this in 2 or 3 years, and Labor will be harping on about how the money was misdirected, there was too much of it, debt and deficit has gone bad, and you will make that the centrepiece of your election platform. And so hypocrisy is not unknown on both sides of politics.
Well, I think Labor will have a lot of opportunity to point to some of these things. But Michael, your thoughts?
Well, look, I think there'd be a lot of people out there who remember the GFC and Labor's approach to that would also remember that Australia economically going into it was in a far stronger position than it is now trying to go into this. And that, I think you've got to admit, Stephen, was largely thanks to the economic stewardship of the coalition government over the 10 years or 11 years of John Howard and Peter Costello. And before you say they had record mining booms and blah, 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 so did you, and you never managed to put a cent away. So that, you know, I think that's a fair enough point to make. But again, I go back to this issue of the debt and deficit. I mean, there will be a lot of Australians long gone, not because of coronavirus, but because of old age, that will never know any of this debt to be paid back. You've been talking a lot about the debt and deficit after the GFC. Not 1 cent of that's been paid back, and that, of course, is small fry compared to what we're doing now. I do have a concern, and perhaps Corey shares this. Corey, there might even be scope for you to come back now that all the real Conservatives are gone, but leaving that aside, my concern is here, this does open the door even further for Labor to borrow hard and to spend hard in the future, because, you know, as Stephen's pointed out, he's probably right, an element of the coalition's attack weapon here of being the best economic managers has been blunted because of the borrowing.
It's a very real point, actually, and whilst the borrowing doesn't appear to be a problem now because interest rates are at 2,000-year lows, when interest rates do creep up because inflation or because of competitive pressures around the world and debt gets unmanageable, we will feel this, and it will threaten our public health system, it will threaten our social welfare system, and unfortunately, Stephen and I will be too old for that, but you know, Daisy will be continuing to work, and you, Michael, as well, but Daisy will be continuing to work and having to pay back these debts that we've all accrued on her behalf. How do you feel about that, Daisy?
Well, yes, I quite like the point that Michael made, that you know, this illness, the effects of it health-wise are disproportionately affecting those who are of the older generations, but certainly the financial ramifications are absolutely going to terribly affect those on the younger end of the spectrum, the millennials, and of course Generation Z, who are those sort of under 24 at the moment. I mean, they're going to have millennials have had a hard enough time with the property market. It's going to be impossible for the Gen Z or Zoomers, as they are called, to own anything. I mean, there could be debt levies, there'll be all sorts of stuff to try to repay this quite excessive borrowing burden that is being put on the government. But, you know, sort of on the subject of hypocrisy in politics. I mean, Stephen, I really do understand as a Labor man how the sort of relative schadenfreude, shall we say, of this situation is quite satisfying for you to watch. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely get that. I'm fond of a little schadenfreude myself sometimes. But, you know, if we want to talk about hypocrisy in policy, I mean, how far in politics, how far back do you want to go? Do you want to go back to, say, the middle of the 20th century? Because if my history is correct, I remember, although both parties were in favour of it, Labor was quite an enthusiastic proponent of a little something called the White Australia policy, which was eventually dismantled by a Labor man, and now decades later they've been relentlessly claiming to be the party of racial equality. I mean, should Labor not be redeemed then? Should we keep going back to the early 20th century and going, oh my goodness me, no, they had a foundation of racism, let's never afford them any kind of benefit of the doubt? And I just think in this time of extreme public distress, and this is to do with Conservatives as well. We all kind of need to put aside this sort of partisan.
I won't mind, Daisy, as long as they never mention debt and deficits being evil again.